Wow.
But
Thank you so much. All right. Thanks.
the nature of culture in Ireland and the state right now is such that it's very similar to big state universities.
So they only had yellow paper in the printer.
It's okay. But the kind of
Thank you so much.
the students is
Thank you so much, Elijah Hickey. Actually, my fiance, he got this dress for me. So, yeah, doesn't he? I was impressed. I was like, wow, I will actually wear that. Yeah.
especially kind of
Do not. I'm not looking at you.
you're not here to learn how to.
This is for you.
Be happy in your 9 to 5, but actually do that as well. But you can go.
Oh, sorry. These are Mozzies. I should have collected these. Yeah, not Ireland, unfortunately. We're on to darker things. I painted over it. He's a zombie now. That would be amazing. Thank you so much.
I hear you do well. Congratulations.
Yeah, all the whole time.
I was excited.
I'm not. They're right there. Did he really?
Seventh grader.
All right. Yes, sir. I'm ready.
Yes.
Good afternoon and welcome. We think a lot about literary genre here at WCC, but those genres are usually epic, lyric, comedy, tragedy. It's not as often that we get an extended treatment of the genre of horror. So when Anna approached me about this project, and said, I want to write a thesis dealing with the genre of horror, I thought, that is very interesting. And it turned out to be very interesting, very intriguing. And it's not just because of the novelty. I think you will appreciate seeing just how much thought and research Anna has put into this project. And it's something that I have enjoyed seeing come along and come to fruition. So I trust that you will be edified. I won't say enjoy, perhaps that might be the wrong word for this particular subject matter, but I do trust that you will be edified by the oration that you're about to hear, entitled The Hungry Dead, Zombies as the Poetic Image of the Corrupt Western Psyche. Please join me in welcoming Miss Anna Grumbine.
Thank you all for coming. I know this is one of the last orations of the day, so I'm impressed you made it this far. I wanted to thank especially Dr. Hill for guiding me into my descent through madness and all the work he put in to help me say something intelligible and intelligent. Thank you, Dr. Virginia, for bearing with me for the second time, working on a thesis. And thank you for being my third panelist, Dr. Schubert. Okay. Let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the malice and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Have you ever tossed a rose into an open grave? Watched it fall in a cascade of fragrant petals to kiss the top of the coffin. The symbolism of this act is not lost on any of us. We understand it as the last goodbye, a final right between our soul and theirs as they move from this life to the next. But what about the symbolism of a coffin? Why do we lock the corpse in a cage, in a box, nail it shut, bury it 6 feet underneath the earth? The ancient Athenians took this practice a step further. They would pin their corpses of the undead, specifically the ones who died under less favorable circumstances, and cover them with heavy rocks and earth to keep them from crawling out of the ground to wreak revenge on the men who put them there unjustly. This is, of course, the classical image of the zombie, and we have more colorful representations now with movies such as World War Z or TV shows The Walking Dead. The zombie has long had a presence in the American zeitgeist, and I'm going to argue that you should care about the zombie and the genre horror that it's found in, because 40 to 45% of Americans do. The first quote, a nationwide horror fan survey by Blumhouse Productions, this is a prominent horror company, reported by Wi-Fi Talents and IMDb, found that 44% of respondents consider themselves horror fans who watch scary movies year-round. End quote. So this means that 2 out of the 5 people that you meet on the street are regularly consuming horror media. So while you might not personally enjoy the grotesque display of human decadence and monsters on a screen, most people, or at least many of Americans, do. And this is relevant because if something is so prominent in our mythos, it's worth at least giving it the time to understand it, and maybe, perhaps, seeing its grotesque beauty. I'm going to argue through the course of my oration, this is kind of the simplified structure, that moderns care about horror because they, like horror, are Nietzschean in spirit, and horror stories reveal their spiritual state for what it actually is. Okay, so the connection with Nietzsche is an interesting one because he had a lot to say about horror and none of it was nice. He didn't particularly like Byron or Poe or any of the great American horror poets, and yet I find it fascinating that his entire philosophy hinges around the ideals of a horror character. Let's start with the most apocalyptic and least well understood sentence that Nietzsche ever said, which is, God is dead. What everyone forgets who says that is the second part of that sentence. And we have killed him. Now, what this means essentially is it's not some sort of rally cry or like a battle cry to rally around about like, welcome to the age of relativism and subjectivity where you can choose your own moral structure and follow it henceforth and ignore the dictums of an old god. It's not some sort of great thing that we're now coming upon. It is a sad cry, a painful cry, one that the prophet in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where those fateful words were spoken, he's simply stating the current state. He's simply revealing the current state of things. He's making a statement about reality, not that now it's time for relativity and subjectivity. The sentence, God is dead, means that our previous structures of meaning are null and void, and they no longer exist. So now modern men have nothing upon which to build their lives or to make anything important to them. Meaning is gone. With the Christian tradition now killed, we have nothing less, and what are we left, and what are we going to do? Nietzsche's answer to that problem, of course, was the Übermensch, or the Superman. The Superman is an interesting sort of person because I don't even think Nietzsche quite understands what he was saying over the 7 great books he wrote concerning him. But I think it can be best distilled in The Birth of Tragedy, where he writes about Oedipus. This is quote 5. Oedipus, murderer of his father, husband of his mother, solver of the riddle of the Sphinx. What is the significance of this mysterious triad of these deeds of destiny? With riddle solving and mother marrying Oedipus in mind, we must immediately interpret this to the effect that wherever by some prophetic and magical power, the boundary of the present and future, the inflexible law of individuation, and in general, the intrinsic spell of nature are broken, and extraordinary counternaturalists must have proceeded as a cause. For how else could one force nature to surrender her secrets by victoriously opposing her by means of the unnatural? This is the secret. which I see involved in the awful triad of the destiny of Oedipus. The very man who solves the riddle of nature, that doubly constituted Sphinx, must also, as the murderer of his father and husband of his mother, break the holiest laws of nature. Indeed, it seems as if the myth were trying to whisper into our ears the fact that wisdom, especially Dionysian wisdom, is an unnatural abomination. I'm going to go further into what Dionysian wisdom is as opposed to Apollonian wisdom later, but leave that aside. Especially Dionysian wisdom is a natural abomination, that whoever, through his own knowledge, plunges nature into an abyss of annihilation, must also expect to experience the dissolution of nature in himself. The sharpness of wisdom turns upon the sage. Wisdom is a crime against nature. End quote. So Nietzsche's laying out three basic principles, three tenets that the Übermensch, in order to be the Übermensch, in order to have the responsibility to reestablish meaning in reality that has left it with the death of God, there's three tenets that this Übermensch has to follow, and that is to murder your father, marry your mother, and solve the riddle of the Sphinx. So murder, marry, solve. To murder your father means that you must have the intellectual pride to overcome all the previous traditions, the sense of the mores, and the previous senses of what's right and wrong, and what gave my life meaning. So break your Christian tradition, ignore that, don't listen to it, because you are the intelligent man, and you are capable of superseding that and going beyond it through great pride. The second tenet, marry your mother, and this is what a large part he spends in that quote talking about, is you need to impose natural by means of the counternatural, and that means to partake in some sort of licentious, morally decadent act that stands as a direct crime against what people understand to be true, like to partake in like the fullest form of lust, essentially. The last act is the most interesting, and it's the final act of the Übermensch, which is you have to fall into a sort of madness. It's solving the riddle of the Sphinx. If you want nature to surrender her deepest secrets to you, you have to go beyond what people think is you have to do mentally unstable things to what would appear to everyone else as mentally unstable things. And that will allow you to, once you've married your mother, murdered your father, you can partake in this transcendent madness that lifts you above and beyond humanity. And now you are the Übermensch, capable of reinstilling meaning in the lives of the masses, of your fellow man, your pathetic fellow man. Okay, so all of this allows that madness that you would enter into as the Übermensch allows you for Dionysiac wisdom. And there's a really important distinction between the two different types of wisdom that Nietzsche talks about in The Birth of Tragedy. They're called the Apollonian and the Dionysiac. And I have a quote on page 2. The two creative tendencies, Dionysiac and Apollonian, developed alongside one another, usually in fierce opposition, each by its taunts, forcing the other to more energetic production, both perpetrating in a discordant concord that agon which the term art but feebly denominates. So the Apollonian deals with the tragic art, essentially the great man killing or consuming himself. And that is the landscape of the ideal, of the supernatural, of the principle of individuation. So the one man standing alone amidst the masses and communing with God. The Dionysiac, that special wisdom you need to become the Übermensch after you've done all these unnatural things and had all this pride, that is its partner in marriage, but completely contrary. So, quote 3, the tremendous awe which seizes a man, this is Dionysiac wisdom, the tremendous awe which seizes man when he suddenly begins to doubt the cognitive modes of experience. In other words, when in a given instance the law of causation seems to suspend itself, and a horrific unity, a mob of discordant actions with no arbiter or will to claim solidarity, hold of them becomes man's perceived reality. This Dionysian unity, a total contrary to Apollonian, is a total contrary to Apollonian individuation. Quote, if we add to this awe, the glorious transport which arises in man, even from the very depths of his nature, at the shattering of the principle of individuation, then we are in a position to apprehend the essence of dynamic rapture, whose closest analogy is furnished by physical intoxication, end quote. Okay, so when you enter into the Dionysiac, you become one. Your will is kind of absorbed with the rest of humanity. You return to your bestial or your natural state, and you no longer have any sort of individuation from the people around you. In quote 4, not only does the bond between man and man come to be forged once more by the magic of the Dionysiac rite, but nature itself, long alienated or subjugated, rises again to celebrate the reconciliation with the prodigal son, man. Now the slave emerges a free man. All the rigid, hostile walls which either necessity or despotism has erected between men are shattered. Now that the gospel of universal harmony is sounded, each individual becomes not only reconciled to his fellow, but actually at one with him, as though the veil of Maya had been torn apart and there remained only shreds floating before the vision of mystical oneness. This is the zombie horde. I'm going to talk to you specifically about the classic representation of the zombie in one of the first zombie stories that we have in America, The Fall of the House of Usher. And then I'm going to use that to go on to talk about zombies in a broader, more pop culture scale and what their significance is and what they're revealing about the modern spirit. But first, to create the connection between Nietzsche and Poe, again, solve, marry, kill. Those are the three tenets of the Übermensch. I'm going to show you how in Poe's story, The Fall of the House of Usher, we watch those three tenets play out to perfection, just not quite in the way, or doesn't quite fit with the image Nietzsche had in his head about what it would be to be the Übermensch. Nietzsche actually, he knew Poe. Oh, he didn't know Poe. He had a lot to say about Poe, however. They were born 50 years apart. I have a quote on quote 6. Nietzsche once called Edgar Allan Poe a man of, quote, fleeting moments, enthusiastic, sensual, childish, frivolous, with a soul which he tries to conceal with some fracture, creating a reoccurring specter of unbelief that chills, end quote, with no substance behind his horror stories. Nietzsche thoroughly bashes Poe for his inadequacy as a poet, but The Fall of the House of Usher, Poe's short story, could very well be the final act of Nietzschean philosophy. All right, so I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of The Fall of the House of Usher for those who aren't familiar with the story. So the story is centered around this man named Usher who lives in this beautiful decaying mansion. And he calls on one of his friends. His name is Ed. We're going to call him Edgar. He's the narrator. And he's called to the house to save him from this malaise that he's fallen into, this madness and this physical disease. And when Edgar first gets to the house, the first thing Usher tells him, he starts talking about the walls of the home and how they are trying to kill him. And his reason for this is, quote 7, the sentience of all vegetable things. This belief, however, was connected with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. Its evidence, the evidence of the sentience, was to be seen, he said, in the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence, which for centuries had molded the destinies of his family, and which made him now what I saw him, what he was. What he is incredibly mad. He holds within himself, throughout the course of the story, it becomes exceedingly obvious that Usher is a man of great intellectual prowess, that he's very intelligent, he reads and he writes books, and he's incredibly scientific, he has great understanding of the world around him. And so he has that kill your father, intellectual pride, disgust for the things that came before him. He also has the decadence and the licentiousness. He has servants who wait upon him hand and foot. He's only played certain stringed instruments that he likes. And he, like every single need that he could possibly want is there at his disposal. He's living in this beautiful, decaying mansion in this weird sort of cycle where he recognizes the mansion is trying to kill him, almost like being drugged or something like that, like being a drug addict. Like he recognizes that the thing that he's obsessed with, the comfort that he's living in, that is the thing that's slowly killing him. There's something at the walls of the house that hate him, and yet he continues to live in this house and will not venture outside of it to confront the rest of the world. And lastly, his madness. Instead of allowing him to transcend, it is making him mentally decay to lower than a beast, afraid of everything, every noise, every trickle of water down the walls. He's pathetic. He's animalistic. He's not the great Übermensch or the transcended man like Nietzsche said he would be if he was able to complete the first two acts and enter finally into madness. So Edgar, he's with Usher and he's trying to help him get him out of this horrible mental state, to heal him of his physical illness, which is brought on by his madness. And as they're, reading poetry, writing poetry, he sees a woman walk up the stairs who Usher informs him is his sister. and it's a little strange. And here's where I would say it's hinted at, but I would say that Usher probably is breaking the unbendable laws of nature in more ways than just being decadent or like being surrounded by comfort. He talks about her in a very familiar, loving sort of way, his blood sister. So, and he informs Edgar that his sister is also dying of a mysterious illness, and a day later he says that she's dead. And in order to keep these scientific men who are, studying her and trying to help her, the doctor's trying to help her, these great high priests of the new moral age, the scientists, from tearing her apart, digging her out of the grave, and putting her back on an operation table to see what was going on, because she's very, very interesting test subject. His solution is, I have this haunted house, let me bury my dead sister who I'm probably having sexual relations with underneath my friend's bed. There's a crypt underneath Edgar's bed. And so they take her body and put her in a tomb, a coffin, underneath Edgar's bed. Interestingly, that's maybe the first time we see the trope of the monster hiding under your bed. And Edgar and Usher, they kind of go their separate ways, although they're still within the house, and it becomes apparent to Edgar that there's something that's eating away on Usher's conscience. That's like a secret, something he's holding inside, and he wants to tell Edgar, but he stops himself every time he starts to say words. So finally, and Usher just, if he was bad before, he's like at basically the point of death. He looks like a skeleton. And so one night there's this terrible storm that condensates around the house, and Usher, in a frenzy, throws open Edgar's doors, screaming, pointing out the window, saying, "Look, we're possessed. We're being haunted. There's something about this house that the world hates, the reality hates." And Usher and Edgar, the narrator, trying to calm down his friend, just puts him in a chair and opens a French romance, like his favorite French romance. He says, "We're going to read this until you calm down." The story of this French romance is a very classic epic or folk tale story. You have the knight and the dragon and the princess that the knight needs to win a shield from the dragon by slaying him to gain the hand of the princess. So as Edgar is starting to read this story, he gets to the part where the knight finds the dragon's lair. And with a sword, he smashes down the door. And at that moment, in the back of the house, Edgar hears the sound of a crash. So just coincidence, whatever, it's an old house. He keeps reading. The next part of the story, the dragon roars at him, and the knight picks up his sword and in classic fairy tale fashion just slashes the dragon across the face, and it dies in one blow and lets out this unearthly shriek. And at that moment, in the back of the house, Edgar hears a scream. He's realizing that something's going on, but he knows that if he looks up at Usher right now, it could be the thing that sends him over the edge, and he just can't do that to his friend. So he keeps looking at the book and keeps reading, and finally the knight takes the shield off of the wall, and it's so heavy that he drops it, and there's a screech of metal against metal, and then distinctly, Edgar hears the sound of giant hinges of the crypt door swinging open. At that point, he can't ignore it anymore. His head snaps up, and Usher, who has been facing him, sitting in the chair, has turned silently in a 180, is now staring at the door to his bedroom. And as Edgar rushes over to grab his shoulder and shake his friends out of this horrible mental state, Usher just turns and looks at him with a completely pale face and says, "I should have told you. When we buried her, she was alive. And now she's coming back to give me everything that I deserve." And at that moment, the doors to their bedroom burst open, and a woman, his sister, in her burial cloth with bloody fingernails that she had used to claw out of her coffin, stands in the doorway. Usher lets out an unearthly shriek, and his sister falls on top of him, killing him instantly. But she didn't do it. Something else did it. Something that's really important for the Übermensch to have, and yet completely failed him in the end. This is, quote, 8. "To an anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have indeed no abhorrence of danger except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved and this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm, fear. The culminating act of the Übermensch, this madness that he was so desperately trying to seek, to be wise in the dynastic rite, leads him to death by his own conscience. He kills himself. The sister doesn't even get a chance. As soon as she falls on top of him, he kills himself out of fright. And as the last part of the story is Edgar riding away, and he watches the House of Usher crumble and finally entomb the last two members of the House of Usher in the earth. Okay, so again, Usher, he stands as the Übermensch, and this is Poe's description of the Übermensch. He has the intellectual pride, the books he reads and writes that drives him into despair, the physical softness or licentiousness in a decaying but comfortable mansion, and maybe doing something with his sister. Madness, Usher kills himself from fear that the house is alive and the inability to face what he's forced his sister to become, and that is the classic zombie. So now we're going to move on to the sister specifically as a zombie and what is different about Poe's zombie versus the modern kind of contemporary version of the zombie. What does it mean to be a zombie in the House of Usher? The dead are awakened by the sins of their society, the haunted Usher house, and because the living desecrated the sacredness of death. Usher tried to play God. Maybe he was trying to save his sister from the scientists' hands of picking her apart. So his answer was, let's just hurry up the death process and bury her alive. And this, she kind of represents in some sense the more classical fury, the effort, or like the divine stepping in when humans have violated the sacredness of death. But zombies, from a more contemporary perspective, are a lot less divinely inspired. They operate on completely on a different moral structure than simply trying to reinstill a sense of morality into a modern man who has chosen to forget it or kill it in himself. The zombies, and I would argue that the modern zombies are so horrifying because we see ourselves, the godless, pathetic, and modern, in their monstrosity. Not only do zombies represent the grotesqueness of a soul's pusillanimity, but they also encapsulate clearly the spiritual essence of a world where God is dead, Apollo slain. With the rejection of higher power or grace, the modern world becomes one of despair and spiritual fluctuation, one where the people we love can be at one moment a transcendent, stunning creature adored, and at the very next a vicious, mindless, so hungry monster. So the image of the zombie, the power of it comes through these two things. I'm gonna go over. I said the two things, the important things I said out of that were that the soul's it represents soul, the dangers of being a pusillanimous soul, and also what happens when you've killed God effectively in a world, in a mythic landscape. So the pusillanimity in the zombie is revealed in the kind of the various ways that you see it in stories, specifically in the Swarm. What does that sound like? Lacks individuation. That's Dionysiac wisdom. They act as a swarm. There's no individuals. Whatever is like told them, or they feel like it should be right, they're connected to that natural instinct that tells them this is kind of feels good, so maybe I should do it. They have no sense of individuation. They act as a swarm. That's the pusillanimous soul. He can't stand alone. He can't do what other people don't. They consume brains. That's obviously a very typical trope. And they eat each other's minds, or the people around them, the ones who are still individualistic, because you need to be consumed and join part like the mob. Otherwise, they lack any sort of strength to stand alone. They need the mob for strength. If you're visited by one zombie, that's pretty easy to kill. It's when they're in a swarm. It's when they're in a mob, a group, in a Dionysiac Bacchic revelry. That's when you should be afraid of the zombie. And of course, they don't eat the heart. They don't eat our hearts because, as modern men, we don't have any. We, like C.S. Lewis said, are men without chests. and the courage and the noble virtues of the pagan have been long dead, laid upon the Nietzschean altar, and for the sake of science and progress. They have an intolerance to non-concurrence mentally, which means that they can't stand the idea that like other things, living things, could go on living in that state. They have to bring them into their decay, and they're never satisfied, which represents an infinite spiritual void in the modern small soul. The second part of this, and I think this is kind of one of the most fascinating things that make zombies so terrifying, is that at one moment you could have someone you love, maybe your sister, maybe your husband, who would give his life or her life for you. But once the zombie takes the bite, you get bitten by a zombie, they become something entirely different, something monstrous, something that hates you and wants to kill you. This is representative of a world where you're no longer grounded or connected to any sort of religion, faith, God, a higher power, no more grace, which means that spiritual fluctuation just becomes everyday life. While our strength, while Nietzsche claims that our strength as Übermensch, or as the great men, is enough to stand alone, the will to power is enough to stand alone against the evils within our own spirit or within our own society, the zombie stands as an antithesis to that, saying that there would be enormous spiritual fluctuation, and that what you are today might not be what you are tomorrow. So, once again, to reiterate, horror is so attractive to the modern soul because it is, like we are, Nietzschean in spirit, and offers a poetic representation of the modern failed spiritual condition. Zombies specifically symbolize the peril pusillanimity threatens a soul with, an existence if we kill God and reject the Apollonian art. And I want to leave you with a final note, which lends itself to the rest of horror if you're interested at all in reading it, which is the monster doesn't go away just because you're not looking for it. Every good horror story tells you that the fate that belongs to the coward is far more gruesome, painful, and ugly than the man who goes out with his sword to face the dragon alone. Whether you are, and when you hide yourself in the walls of your little mansion and try to stand back and stand away from the monster, it'll start creeping out of the woodwork, out of the stones. It'll come find you instead. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We'll begin with questions from the panel, and then we'll turn it over to the room.
Anna, I'm trying to figure out why it's attractive to the modern soul specifically.
Yeah.
So I make sure I'm understanding. Your argument is that the zombie instantiates this Dionysian mob mentality, kind of lack of individuation, which is an expression of the modern person. And it's also the completion or the next step of the Superman. All right. Why would that not serve as some sort of warning? A change your ways kind of message that would be coming through the zombies, as opposed to, oh, I really like stories about zombies.
Yeah.
I don't understand the attractive.
What's attractive specifically about them? Well, isn't
Also,
it?
did I understand your argument first?
I would say so. I wouldn't say zombies. The only clarification I would make is zombies are not the final end to the Übermensch. The argument from Poe is that that's what you inevitably become. But Nietzsche would say that sounds a lot more like the masses who ought to be led by the Übermensch, not.
Right.
Yeah, the zombies are the masses, not. And yet it's just, I was stating that it's interesting that regardless of if you choose the tenets of the Übermensch, you inevitably become a zombie anyways, even if the zombie is the thing that Nietzsche hates. So specifically, what is attractive about the zombie? I would say that in general, warning stories, or I do agree, there's something about them that is an attempt to warn us of what we could be if we fall into pusillanimity. But I would say that the truth is attractive. There's something about staring into the mirror like Narcissus, that you have this desire, whether or not the truth drives you insane or hurts you when you confront it. we want to see that almost. And I think we're willing to kind of experience the grotesque or the ugly so that we can see ourselves for what we are. And that's a different sort of attraction. The beauty, the attraction of beauty or something like that, it draws us to it because we want, almost in a sense, you can argue with me on this, but it's not my point of my thesis, that we want to be something more like it, the beauty. The beauty of the zombie, or the attraction of the zombie, comes from, I think it's kind of almost a brutal truth. It allows us to subconsciously recognize our own failings. And I think a lot of people resonate with that in a landscape that affords them little avenue for the truth, or like little things that are willing to scratch that itch we have subconsciously, that there's something wrong about the way we're living. So I think that it's kind of a weird, inverted form of attraction, but I think it's attractive because it's true. And people recognize that subconsciously about themselves.
So are you saying that horror is a moral genre? Or at least it has the potential?
I think so. I think it's Nietzschean. It's Nietzschean morality.
I was like,
What do you mean by moral?
yeah, maybe I'm confused by this. Is it an endorsement of Nietzschean morality, right? Or is horror, at least the modern examples, zombies, a kind of warning against Nietzschean morality? If we embrace the Nietzschean image, we will become zombies and be afraid, and don't do that. Or is it actually just giving voice to the Nietzschean?
Yeah, I think it can be seen in two ways. It's interesting that I chose. Well, I think it's a little strange that I chose to focus on the zombie, because it's one of the only examples of a monster that represents the Nietzschean morality failed. But if you watched maybe like Silence of the Lambs or something like that, or if you have a monster like the vampire, there's something more noble about them. So they're almost like Nietzschean ideals that succeed in the world. And like the beautiful representation, there's different monsters that fall under that category. Yeah, and the zombie specifically represents Nietzschean ideals tried and failed. But either way, yeah, to answer your question specifically, I would say that horror is the logical, poetic conclusion to what would happen should you try to enact these ideals in your life, whether you end up being a magnanimous monster like a vampire, or you just end up crumbling and becoming a zombie. I would say that in general, most of the horror stories that I've read are very the monster, and therefore like the kind of the protagonist, often they adopt into themselves with varying degrees of effectiveness the Nietzschean ideals. So it is Nietzschean ideals played out in reality, and clearly because they're kind of horrible stories, the awful stories, that's the poet's answer to, they're probably not great things to enact in your life, but that's up to the reader who reads a horror story and what they get out of it.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the French Romance. I'm just curious about the relationship between then like, romance and horror, if part of the antidote.
Yeah, isn't that so interesting?
It's so strange. It's so bizarre. Although maybe not so bizarre. I mean, because romance and horror historically are actually rising right people the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Same genre.
Exactly.
But anyways, I'm really interested in that kind of
What is that?
relationship there. And then I mean, at the end of your erasement, it seemed like you were suggesting that we kind of take on some sort of knightly
Roll forward.
courage here, roll, and right, instead
Yeah,
of be the pusillanimous coward, but be the knight there.
Right. Yeah, no, I love the fact that Poe included a knight, is kind of trying to be the antidote to his madness. The story of the classic romance story. I think what's specifically so interesting about it too is that the part that Poe ends up focusing on is not the story, like the love between the princess and the knight. It's actually the encounter with the dragon. And you see simultaneously in the story, you've got, here's a horror character's interaction with the dragon, or what it does what he does when confronted with the monster. Here's what a folk hero or maybe an epic hero would do when he's confronted with the monster. And and this is the best part. The knight is entering the house of the dragon. In a horror story, the dragon's already in the house. It's in your house. it's in this like place of familiarity. So the fact that I think it was an effort to juxtapose, as long as Poe was actually intending to do this, and yeah, maybe this is what Poe's intention was, that he's placing the dragon or the monster in a different location. And if you notice, the dragon is an entity that the knight goes out to kill and attain something from. The dragon or the zombie in Poe's story is something that exists because of his own sin. He caused that dragon, he buried that dragon in his own house. And I think that there's supposed to be that kind of counter difference of like, here is the pusillanimous man's reaction to the dragon, and here's where he's going to find it, which is in the place closest to him. The monster becomes the person he loves. Whereas the magnanimous man, the person he loves, he's killing the dragon for. The dragon is a separate entity. It's merely a force of evil, not good and evil kind of intermingled in a confusing manner that now is monstrous. And so I think it was just a really cool juxtaposition of the locale of the monster is what he was attempting to do or show of the audience and also the different reaction of the knight versus usher to evil. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it seems like horror of the monster is internalized. The dragon becomes the self.
There's something more personal about the monster than like an outside dragon that I need to go out and get something from or kill. Yeah.
Oh, so thank you, Hannah. I want to find out what you mean by corrupt Western psyche. You're making a lot of assumptions about modernity, about some loss of something that was before, but I'm not sure what. Is it Christianity? What's happened to corrupt the Western psyche that then makes room for the zombie? And then a parallel question perhaps might be, or at least it's one that is provoked by your talk, and that has to do with the understanding of the Dionysian in Nietzsche and the Apollonian in Nietzsche as applied to the story of the fall of the House of Usher. But I'll save the Dionysian first. First, tell me about what the Western psyche was that might have been good, that became corrupted, and what corrupted it, and what are you talking about?
When I say corrupt, yes.
Yeah.
Do you want Nietzschean answer or my answer? Which one do you prefer?
Well, I want the one that makes sense within your thesis. Because
Okay.
it assumes.
Yes.
You assume, that there's some falling off from something that was once whole. I just want to know what that wholeness was.
Yep. So I would say, okay, well then that's kind of a combination of both answers. I think Nietzsche, what I would say when I say call Western psyche corrupt, I'm saying that in some sense I'm agreeing with Nietzsche, not for the reasons that he would say that the Western psyche or the modern psyche is corrupt. He says that God is dead and we've lost, our previous structures of meaning. And I would agree with that generally, saying that modern man, that corruption, I think, stems from, it's corrupt because we listen to the wrong man for the solution. I think Nietzsche...
When did this happen? Is there some historical moment or group of thinkers that ushered in? I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
Like we all bandy about bad modernity, and I don't know what anybody's talking about around.
Right.
So,
So, okay, a group of thinkers that I think, and I talked a lot about this in my thesis, directly responsible for a lot of the corruption. But I'm not talking about corruption in general. I mean specifically pusillanimity.
so
That's the corruption.
The
loss of greatness,
the loss of the saints,
yes.
the loss of the big
Yeah.
figures.
I'm not I'm not like trashing on modernity generally because I'm aware there's plenty of virtues to it, but I'm saying that magnanimity specifically is the one that we lose, and that was Nietzsche's problem with modernity as well. And I would say the Enlightenment, specifically Maitreid and Sade, were two of the biggest kind of movers and shakers as far as that goes, and it started way back with Descartes. And I think it's the loss of grounding yourself into some higher calling, about trying to impose your own intellectual, like blanket your own intellect over great things you don't understand. And I think the coming of science, there came this fascination with trying to parse things out and place it on the operating table and put everything under microscope slides, and that's kind of all that mattered. And it's interesting too, because you have this kind of subpar, generally, form genre of poetry, and that only had a real presence during the time of the Enlightenment, specifically with Mary Shelley, and ever afterwards. So I think that it's kind of the poetic brain, this poetic child of the Enlightenment horrors, and that corruption exists. This type of corruption that I'm talking about, the pusillanimity, is a result of the Enlightenment thought that allowed us to perceive ourselves as intellectual giants, and that was the only thing that was necessary. God and any sense of honor or morality is less important to scientific truth and the man's mind. So again, with leaving the heart out of it, we've like men without chests, essentially. And our greatest glory and victory is our mind, and in leaving the heart behind and the timocratic virtues, you get kind of a pathetic, corrupt psyche. And so, yeah, that's what I mean specifically.
Okay, so in the Dionysian, in the classical, I'm not talking about Nietzsche here because he has a different alternative with the Apollonian, but in sense, say, of your reading of the Bacchae, the women who lose their normal roles or leave their normal roles and celebrate a kind of unity with each other and with nature and with the whole created order. It's actually a corrective to a rigid, structured Thebes, and Dionysus is a corrective. And what seemed to me, I'm wondering, this was engendered by your talk, whether the zombies of the horror films are in fact an image of a hollowed out communal order, rather than being Dionysian in that older sense. It's a kind of communal absence. The mob comes together communally after the world that should bring them back together communally with a real robust religion and robust community and a robust attachment to the transcendent, which you kept talking about in your thesis. After that all fails, then the zombie, they're looking for what's been hollowed out, or they swarm us with their specter because they remind us of what's been hollowed out. So are they positive in a kind of converse way to how the Dionysian was actually positive in the ancient world for structures being too tight? And in our world, structures not meaning anything at all.
Yeah, exactly. I was interesting. I was wondering if you're going to ask about the Bacchae, because I love that story. It's one of my favorite from the Greeks. And I wanted, with the clarification that the zombie is, again, an attempt to enter into that Dionysiac revelry. And like you said, there's this hollowness to them because they have, the Bacchae are guided by a god who sets them free. They're still, although they're returning to nature in like in a strange kind of grotesque but proper way. The man who joins the modern man who joins the Dionysiac revelry becomes, I believe that he becomes somewhat of a beast, because behind that revelry there is no divinity kind of guiding it. There's no higher, you're not breaking something subpar to ascend to something greater. You're not joining Dionysus's revelries to worship him. Instead, you're in your corporate office and you're getting your morning cup of coffee, and then the secretary on the next cubicle over leans over and bites your arm. And now you've joined the Bacchic revelry, but there was no it's a disease. It infects you. It's mindless. It's not calling you to a higher ascension like the Bacchae are. So again, it's like Nietzsche, he keeps putting forward these ideas, and the point of my thesis was to put Poe in counterposition to him, because he was so critical of Poe. He had the bait there. I couldn't not make them converse with each other, because I think that while Nietzsche says that this would be some sort of like there's still a way through the arts for Bacchic revelry. The horror author, specifically the zombie horror author, would say that this is what a Dionysiac revelry, a Bacchic revelry in the modern age would look like, hollowed out, a zombie.
And then are we supposed to have more self-knowledge because is one of the attraction of the 44% who like this kind of thing, is part of it is that they're finding some sort of self-knowledge in the zombie film?
I think so. It's strange because there's the fire. You've got to wonder at a certain point what it is about fire and brimstone sermons that keep dragging people back to them. They're not pleasant or comfortable, and I'm not making the argument that horror is supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to be horrific. I think that whether we like it or not, the truth in many faces will reveal itself to us, and we'll want it anyways. And so I think that modern men find this great attraction because they do see themselves subtly in the zombie, in these horror characters. They're a lot like us. If you watch good horror stories, you realize they don't really even have a backstory. There's not much interesting about them. They're just a lot of nothing. That's what you need to be a good horror character. And I think a lot of people sitting on their couches playing Call of Duty and eating their 5th bag of Cheetos can really relate to that. They can understand what it means to be nothing and yet confronted with the monster anyways, because that's what life will bring to them. It's the monster.
Thank you, Anna. Your image of the secretary biting one's arm from the next cubicle makes me very glad that my office has doors.
You do have Dr. Shields next to you, so you gotta watch it.
My question is about horror as a genre. The tropes that appear frequently in horror stories are often pretty old, right? They don't originate with the genre of horror as you've been talking about it as a sort of product of modernity or a modern or postmodern genre. The Greeks and Romans had ghost stories, and of course one of your major examples here is Oedipus Rex, where Oedipus Rex with these 3 features. And I'm thinking too about Orestes descending into madness after committing a horrible crime contrary to nature that he didn't have a choice but to do in a way, but also did a horrible crime contrary to nature, and so is infected with this miasma, this pollution. So I'm curious, in your view, is it possible, either in practice or theoretically, is it possible for there to be a pre-modern horror story? Is it possible to have, to make an argument that Oedipus Rex is in fact a horror story? Not thinking of the rest of the story, but just
not the cycle, just
Oedipus Rex. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to have a pre-modern horror story, or is horror only possible after the philosophical developments of the early modern periods?
And there's Banquo and and Hamlet's ghost. It's interesting. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I think there should be made a distinction between horror and a thriller, which again has a new name, but I think the distinction, I've thought a lot about this, is you could also I've heard this argument about Dracula as well, that technically because the monster is killed in the end, or the good guys win and the good guys are, vampire hunters and powerful, that therefore it's no longer a horror story. I would say in general, what distinguishes older horror stories, or what I would classify as actual horror from maybe more classical representations like the ghost in Hamlet, or kind of the grotesque acts of Oedipus, or the distorted, twisted acts of Oedipus to plunge out his own eyes, is you can have the accidents of horror, you can have the monster even, but it depends on the character or the type of soul that you're dealing with the protagonist. So in a horror story, it's absolutely pivotal, again, that the part of the attraction comes from this burning spotlight it places on ourselves when we see the horror character doing his thing, because he is small-souled. His reaction, it's not the dragon or the monster that makes a horror story. It's the actions of the protagonist and whether he acts in a magnanimous fashion or shrinking into himself and acting as a coward, I would say. So you can have, and this is odd, I haven't found yet prior to Mary Shelley. I'm sure I know the Germans did it. I know that there's like folk stories that would be classified as horror. I didn't study any of those or read any of those for my work. It was mostly around American horror, as you know. But it isn't the accidents. It isn't the monster that makes something horror. It's the reaction of the protagonist and what sort of nature or character he has.
Does chronology have anything to do with it? Is horror made possible by the collapse of a Christian morality, perhaps, in a way that doesn't work if there is no Christian morality yet to have collapsed?
Oh my gosh, I would say so, yes, because this is what's so interesting about so many horror stories is that as soon as you bring the exorcist into a demon story, the story's kind of over. There's the presence of Catholicism or of religion within a horror story. There's this kind of tension, this constant tension between the person who wrote the horror story and religion, because in many instances, I would say you could classify it kind of horror in three ways: in divine or God horror, in demonic horror, and in human horror, monster horror, or in human horror. And all of them kind of ask questions about what is man, where did he come from, what should our relationship with divinity be? So even in monster horror, you have to ask yourself who created it. There's a further looking into and beyond the monster that has to happen. It seems like the death of Christianity, so to speak, according to Nietzsche, the death of Christianity that happened is absolutely consequential to a good horror story being written, because often the story is about man finding God and not in the way he wanted to. And it's kind of this realization that we may have forgotten divinity, but it didn't forget us. And now maybe it's pretty upset that we decided to spend so long pretending he wasn't there. Again, the image of the Fury comes to mind, where it's like you're not paying the right homage to God and to the divine. So if you're going to pretend that it's not there and push it away, it'll come find you instead. So I think the death of Christianity is extremely pivotal to understanding the genre of horror.
Thank you. Question from the audience.
Cynthia?
Why is the feminine so important in horror? Since it's either most horror stories, it's either like the monster is feminine or like the hero. Why is that?
That's really, I love that question. Specifically, there was this great horror story that I recently, watched, not read. It was called The Babadook, and it's about essentially a mother confronting her own grief. And this monster, like her grief kind of personifies itself into a monster, becomes incarnate with this monster. I think that's what's so fascinating about the mother specifically is if you wanted to make something really scary, you need to take what's pure, beautiful, or even better, innocent, and just add a little gore. Make it slightly put it in the weird valley, make it slightly off. So the corruption of the best is the worst. There's another lilies that fester smell worse than weeds. And okay, but that's way too simplistic of an answer. I would say specifically what's so fantastic about the feminine, besides the fact that if you're the devil, you hate women more because of Mary and all that, is that she has this power to create and be idealistically kind of the greatest of the created creatures because of Mary. And specifically in her ability to give birth and life. If I were to try to terrify someone the most, the image of the mother is supposed to be the thing that brings in, that comforts, that protects. So if you want to make someone absolutely terrified, first you ground them in something we all understand. So you take the mother, because we all have one, hopefully. And then the second thing you do is that you take something that's beautiful and comforting and life-giving, and you corrupt that. And then you have like horror stories like Room 99 about like the Antichrist being birthed or whatever. So I would say, yeah, simply the corruption of the best is the worst. But specifically in the innocence and the gentleness, when you take gentleness and innocence and just cover it in blood and give it sharp nails, that's when you have the all-consuming mother. That's when you can kind of affect the greatest amount of terror in your audience. Jeff?
Thank you, Anna, for the original. It was pretty gruesome. In more like recent zombie movies and stuff, there's also the theme of finding a cure for the zombie. Like I can think of in World War Z, there's not finding a cure. Like even in the Maze Runner, also now using those scientific, technological means to find a cure. So, and it never really works, probably because they're also utilizing that science and technology. So I guess with that, is there any hope for sense of redemption for the zombies? Like for those who have already
who have already turned.
Yeah. Like, is it realistic?
Yeah, there is a sense of redemption. You put a bullet in their head. It's like at that point you've corrupted. You've turned into a monster. You started the wheel of fate, and now you've become something else. And the proper response to the good that's left in the world is to kill you. I would say. And what's really interesting about that story, specifically World War Z, is that the answer to the problem is to accept the natural disease. You remember that? You know, at the end of the story. So essentially in World War Z, he's trying to find the cure, and he finds out the only people that the zombies don't bite are the ones with life-threatening diseases, natural diseases. So the disease that was created by man that creates all the zombies, that thing corrupts your nature and turns you into a monster. But the thing that lung cancer, that was like a kind of a blight given by God. You have to kind of accept that evil into yourself, or reconnect yourself with nature and reality and being part, not trying to ignore. It's by accepting death that he's able to overcome the unnatural death, essentially. So again, a reinstallation of himself in the natural order underneath God. And he uses, it's so cool because he uses the means to the end of like saving himself from the zombie, from a worse fate than just death, is by accepting death, but natural death, not human-made death. Did I answer your question? What was your question? Okay, good.
We can take one more question.
Milo?
Thank you. That was really cool. Being one of the like 60% who don't watch horror, I was wondering, would you say that we should all become 44% and make it 100? Like, do we all need this sort of self-reflection that horror gives us? Do we all need like a little bit of it? Do some of us need more? Like what or do some of us not need any? Only the ones of us living in our parents' basements? No, like.
Or do you specifically? Well, first of all, I want to say congratulations. You don't need the cathartic release that horror affords, or like a staring into yourself and finding out that you're a zombie. So that might be a good place to start. I'm not suggesting that you all go forth and watch The Shining for like 5 times over or something. I think that I'm not blaming the people either who do love horror. I think there is something honest and real about confronting humanity in its fallen state that I think if you approach the right horror story correctly, it can be very beneficial to yourself. I don't think that, like, if all you're ever getting out of it is, ew, I hate this fear, then either you're not encountering the right horror story, or it's really not meant for you. I think it does us all like a little bit of humility to stare at the pusillanimous man and ask ourselves seriously, is this me? And I think that horror of any of the genres is the best at like making us uncomfortable about ourselves. And every now and then, I don't think it's bad for us to be uncomfortable with what we are, so we can kind of rise above our state. Because I'm willing to bet the majority of the 60% are probably not the magnanimous man. Just putting that out there. But doesn't mean you have to enjoy it. And if you're going to read you want to read a good horror story, you should read Cormac McCarthy or Lovecraft. That would be my answer to that question. Don't start with The Conjuring or whatever.
Let's thank Anna once again.
Thank you.
was definitely, it was, thank you. I mean, it was kind of both of them. It was both of them. They were pretty proud.
Thank you.